All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another RELC lunchtime chat. Today is just as special as any other. It's just that we're gonna be here. We're gonna spend some time getting edified and learning some more about America's early activities, which lead us to post-Civil War. I've gotten a preview of Dr. Parker's presentation, and I'm excited to just be in the space and to understand that he's going to make some of this local. He's going to focus on a period of time that is well deserving of more scholarship, the Reconstruction era. We're going to get some understanding of something I just shared before I push record of why these matters in our society persist to disturb the progress that we could actually be making. There's a lot of rationale and reason that we need to unpack. So I'm looking forward to it. Dr. Parker, I'm gonna give you the floor, and I don't know if I need to do another introduction. It's the third piece in this series, but Dr. Parker, Professor Emeritus, someone I hold in the highest regard, take it away.
Thank you, Felton, and good afternoon, everybody. This third episode of trying to understand American history. Felton, I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to ask you to make that available.
See if that does it, Dr. Parker.
Good. That's it. Folks, see that?
Got it.
Okay. As I was telling Felton from the outset, this is such a dynamic period in American history. We began talking about the period 1865 to the present. Unfortunately, we have to compartmentalize history, but understanding that all of it is inextricably woven together. It is tied together, but we have to compartmentalize it oftentimes to present it. And so that is essentially what I'm doing this afternoon. I want to look at 5 major themes in American history after 1865. Reconstruction and its aftermath, the North Carolina experience, deconstruction and reconstruction in North Carolina, what we refer to as Southern redemption. Take a look at the Native American question, establishment of reservations, a plan of genocide, Native American legislation, and oftentimes referred to as Western redemption. Take a look at the growth of the industrial order, industrialism after 1865, immigration to the United States. All of this is tied together. Definitely, immigration is tied to the growth of the industrial order, and conclude with the quest to acquire lands beyond the United States and the rise of imperialism. And all of you know that each of these topics we could talk about for 8 hours with each of them. But we have about an hour and a few minutes. And so we're going to be highlighting these periods, these episodes in American history, and hopefully it will spark you to go out and do further research to learn what was happening, especially at the local level with these major themes in American history. Taking a look at Reconstruction and its aftermath. We'll start with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, December 6, 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. A few months later, something that we don't talk about very much is the 1866 Civil Rights Bill. Ask a student when the first Civil Rights Bill was passed, and they'll say it was 1964. not realizing that even one was passed in 1957, going all the way back to 1866. And let me just read just a little portion of this, because this bill sets the stage for what is to come with regard to the United States trying to do something decent to bring in the former slaves. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. And such citizens of every race and color, without regard to any previous condition of servitude or involuntary servitude, slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, and give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, as enjoyed by white citizens, and shall be subject to like punishment, pains, and penalties, and to none other any law, statute, ordinance, regulation, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. That is a very powerful piece of legislation, because now, just a couple of months after the 13th Amendment was ratified, the former slaves, those 4 million people who were formerly enslaved, are now looked at as citizens of the United States and of the states in which they were born. The second part, be it enacted that any person who under color of any law, statute, ordinance, regulation, or custom shall subject or cause to be subjected any inhabitant of any state or territory to the deprivation of any right secured or protected by this act, or to different punishment, pains, or penalties on account of such person having at any time been held in a condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, and so forth and so on. And on a conviction shall be punished by fine not exceeding $1,000, or imprisonment not exceeding 1 year, or both in the discretion of the court. So what the second section of the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 is saying is that you can go to jail if you violate the rights of the former slaves. Right. This was passed April 9th, 1866. And the reason it was passed then is because actually the president of the United States at that time, Andrew Johnson, had actually vetoed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. And the second part of this bill was really designed to overturn the Black codes that have been passed as early as June and July of 1865 by Mississippi and Alabama and North Carolina. North Carolina passed 9 of these Black codes. And so Section 2 was actually designed to overturn that. Well, even though it becomes law in 1866, there were people in Congress who believed that you actually need an amendment because, you know, it's a law. That law can be actually overturned at any time. And when you look at why President Johnson vetoed legislation, he believed that it would lead to a life of laziness and dependency for the former slaves if you became a citizen of the United States. And he believed that the Freedmen's Bureau was a handout. And so he actually vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau and Congress overrode both of those vetoes. He believed that Congress did not have the constitutional powers to pass such legislation because it was outside their purview. This was a state matter, he said. Beyond that, it was a violation of the rights of whites, and the former slaves were not fit to assume citizenship. It's Andrew Johnson, who was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. Why a need for the 14th Amendment? There was a need for the 14th Amendment to, in essence, do what the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 did. And so you look at the fact that it was passed in 1866 and ratified in 1868. It was a hope that it could never be overturned. What we're trying to do is to ensure that the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 is permanent. That was why the 14th Amendment was passed and eventually ratified. Very early, it was a battle between President Johnson and Congress as to who was going to dictate the terms of Reconstruction. Johnson believed, of course, that he should be responsible for Reconstruction. Congress believed that they should be responsible. In the final analysis, if we had more time, we could actually go into Johnson's attempts to reconstruct the South. But essentially, the Congress won out. The so-called radical Congress in the House and the Senate actually won out. And so they passed the first Reconstruction Act, referred to as the Military Reconstruction Act, in March of 1867. And when you look at the preamble, whereas no legal state governments or adequate protection for life or property now exists in the rebel states, and those states are named, and whereas it is necessary that peace and good order should be enforced in said states until loyal and Republican state governments can be legally established. Therefore, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives that said rebel states shall be divided into those 5 military districts and made subject to the military authority of the United States. And so those 10 states, because actually by 1867, Tennessee had come back into the Union. So the remaining 10 states were divided into those 5 military districts. North Carolina and South Carolina, for example, were placed in 2nd District. And so the South is now under military rule. And under this first Reconstruction Act, the Southern states had to hold new constitutional conventions, and most of them held those conventions in 1868, including North Carolina. And I would say that really, if we had more time, we could spend an hour looking at the North Carolina Constitution of 1868, because it was really one of the most liberal, so-called liberal documents of all the Southern states. And had it not been overturned in 1870 and 1871, I think that Southern redemption would not have occurred in North Carolina as early as it did. But the former slave owners regained power as early as 1870 in North Carolina. And so it never did become a reality. Between June 22nd and 25th, 1868, 7 Southern states were all readmitted to the United States because they had rewritten their constitutions. Many of you may be familiar with the Tenure Office Act that was passed as a part of these Reconstruction Acts. The Command of the Army Act was passed, and a total of 4 Reconstruction Acts were actually passed in 1868, 1867, and 1868. You also may be familiar with the founding of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866. It was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. As a matter of fact, when you look at the struggle of the United States Congress to do what they were doing, to pass legislation that would pull the former enslaved people into becoming citizens of the states in which they were born, citizens of the United States, and other legislation, all along there was pushback in an organized way and in a general way, just on a daily basis. Former slaves were being killed in North Carolina. One can look at the Freedmen's Bureau records and look at the many assaults, not only on the former slaves, but on Republicans generally in North Carolina, South Carolina, and throughout the South. But this organized pushback occurred in 1866 by the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that haunts us right down to the present time. And this is actually a mask from the Reconstruction era that one could see Ku Klux Klan members wearing. The case of North Carolina, for example, just to bring it home, the Klan was very powerful in Tennessee, in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and especially South Carolina. And although it could be found in many places throughout North Carolina, it was absolutely powerful in Orange and Alamance counties, and actually I could add to that Caswell County. Between 1868 and 1870, more than 20 murders were committed by the Klan in North Carolina, and that is a very conservative estimate. Clubbings, whipping, beatings, and many of you may be familiar with Wyatt Outlaw, the killing of Wyatt Outlaw, the murder, the lynching of Wyatt Outlaw in Graham, North Carolina. And that was in March of 1870. He was head of the Union League. And today we struggle to actually have the area where he was killed. We're trying to get it named in his honor. Right now it's called the Sesquicentennial Park, located right across the street from the place where he was lynched, and right across from the courthouse, where we still struggle to bring down a Confederate monument. And they put this on his, they pinned this to his chest: beware you guilty, both white and black. If you remember the Union League, whether you're black or white, you're Republican, then you are guilty. Not very long after the assassination of Wyatt Outlaw was the killing of John W. Stevens. Stevens was also a member of the Union League. He was white, Republican. He was from Caswell County, county that borders Alamance County. He was actually sentenced to death by the KKK and killed in the courthouse. They actually kidnapped him and put him on trial, and actually executed him right there in the courthouse. At its height, the Klan boasted about 40,000 members in North Carolina. But dip back just a little bit. All of you are familiar with the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. And a lot of people say he was absolutely impeached for political reasons only. And to some extent that was definitely true, but he did violate the Tenure of Office Act that had been passed by Congress. And the Military Act was also violated. But what was really on trial was his record of vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau Act and Civil Rights Act and the Reconstruction Acts that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. trial itself lasted a couple of months, and all of you do know that he was not convicted, though he was impeached. He was not convicted. You name other presidents who may have been impeached since Andrew Johnson back in 1868. I think those would be Bill Clinton. Can you name a president who was impeached twice? That would be Donald J. Trump. When you begin to look at the so-called radical Congress and look at the fact that it appears that there were some people who were about the business of doing several things. First of all, the 13th Amendment, freeing those people who have been enslaved in this country for 250 years, making them citizens of the United States, ensuring under the 14th Amendment that they would be citizens of the United States. And there's a portion of the 14th Amendment that says no state may abridge the rights, privileges, and immunities of its citizens without due process. And that 14th Amendment is going to be tested right on down to yesterday when it comes to race in this country. But the other thing that so-called radical Republicans wanted to do, and surely Black people were pushing themselves, was this right to vote. So Congress actually passed the 15th Amendment, and it was ratified by at least 3/4 of the states in February of 1870. And when you look at the 15th Amendment, we still play with it today because so many of the states, I think in the last 10 years at least 1,500 laws have been passed by especially the southern states to take away, to play with, to deteriorate in many ways this right of citizens to vote. Happened in North Carolina, continues to happen in North Carolina by our very, very ultra-conservative legislature down in Raleigh. But at least in 1870, the right of citizens of the US to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And we absolutely see this happening every day. There are attempts to abridge those rights and to absolutely deny people the right to vote. As we continue to look at what Congress was doing in terms of trying to provide first-class citizenship for the former slaves, because the Ku Klux Klan by 1870, by some estimates, had already killed 5,000 people throughout the South. Those in Congress, some of those in Congress felt that it was necessary to come up with some legislation to curb the activities of the Ku Klux Klan and to essentially destroy the Klan. And so the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 were actually known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts. That it shall be the duty of every person and officer to give to all citizens of the United States the same and equal opportunity to perform prerequisite and to become qualified to vote without distinction of race, color, previous condition of servitude. And if any person or officer shall knowingly omit to give full effect to this section, he shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor and shall, on conviction thereof, be fined no less than $500 or imprisoned not less than 1 month and not more than 1 year at the discretion of the court. They actually a total of 4 enforcement acts were passed in 1870 and 1871. And the real significance here is that they did a lot to curb the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan, in many cases, especially in South Carolina, Tennessee, and in some parts of North Carolina, kind of went underground for many, many years. But just because they were not organized, just because you don't have it happening in the name of the Ku Klux Klan, doesn't mean that terror ceased all of a sudden. Racial terror continued, uptick in lynchings, of course, after 1882, the daily killing of former slaves and Republicans continued, whether it was the Knights of White Camellia, the Rifle Association of South Carolina and Louisiana, whether it was the Ku Klux Klan. Most of the killings actually occurred not by organized individuals, but by individual citizens in the mountains of North Carolina, in Wilmington, North Carolina, in Elizabeth City, in the Piedmont area of North Carolina, in South Carolina, and throughout the South. It was that the daily destruction of the Black body that we really need to focus on as well. Look at those organized attempts to ensure that folks do not become first-class citizens, but we have to look at the daily activities. And the Freedmen's Bureau records actually provide much of that information. But one of the things that happened with these enforcement acts was the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. And it happened here in North Carolina in 1870 and 1871. And essentially, you can do what you want to with the body. And it doesn't even have to be, if you believe that a person has violated a law, you don't actually have to have them in court to prosecute them. So you're actually suspending the writ of habeas corpus, which actually provides protection. It says that I can't try you if you're not here. So the body has to be present. But here it's actually being suspended. And as we look at it historically, the writ of habeas corpus was suspended in 1861, 1871, and the latest suspension occurred in 2006 under the Military Commissions Act that was passed by George Bush, signed by George Bush. So what was the real significance of the 1871 Enforcement Act? And it was that it slowed the activities of the KKK. And when we hear about the KKK again, in terms of an organized way, it's probably during in terms of what Congress did in trying to fulfill this mission of freeing the former slaves and making them citizens of the United States and ensuring that that citizenship would hold and giving them the right to vote and protecting that right to vote under the Enforcement Acts. The Civil Rights Bill of 1875 pretty much rounded out the effort to ensure that the former slaves would become first-class citizens of the United States. A very powerful piece of legislation that was pushed by Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and he was able to get it through Congress. There are some things he could not get in the Civil Rights Bill of 1875, and that was Black and white children going to school together. We'll allow you to do this, do that, ride on public conveyances, but terms of black kids and white kids going to school together, no. So Charles Sumner was not able to get that in the Civil Rights Bill of 1875. This preamble, I think, is important. Whereas it is essential to just government, we recognize the equality of all men before the law and hold that it is the duty of government in its dealings with the people to mete out equal and exact justice to all of whatever nativity, race, color, or persuasion, religious or political, and it being the appropriate object of legislation to enact great fundamental principles into law. Therefore, be it enacted that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. So in essence, Black folk can go anywhere they want to go in terms of public places. Or could they? Well, essentially, America wasn't ready for it. The law passed, but America didn't pass. And essentially, wherever Black folk went, they continued to be turned back. There was just hundreds and hundreds of cases across the country where this 1875 Civil Rights Bill did not become a reality. And so early on, people began to sue. How many times did people sue in California and in North Carolina, and New York, and Pennsylvania, Boston, and other places because the 1875 Civil Rights Bill was not being lived up to. 5 cases eventually went before the US Supreme Court. One case involved a man in New York City, Mr. Davis, who had gone and tried to get into the theater to see a play. He had a very fair complexioned woman with him. The doorman probably thought that she was white, and Davis presented his tickets, and he told Davis that the tickets were no good. Davis was upset. He left the box office and actually got a 17-year-old white boy to go purchase more tickets for him. The guy gave him the tickets. He presented those tickets. Davis presented those tickets to the doorman. The doorman said, "These tickets are no good." Another case involved a Black man and a fair complexion woman who boarded the train, and they would not allow him to be seated. And similar cases were part of this class action suit that eventually went before the US Supreme Court. And the court ruled in the fall of 1883. The majority decision said that the court determined that the amendment prohibited only official state-sponsored discrimination and cannot reach discrimination practiced by privately owned places of public accommodation. In other words, the 1875 Civil Rights Bill did not protect people who may have gone into a present-day Walmart. And you go into a Walmart and they say, "I'm sorry, we can't serve you." Well, essentially, the US Supreme Court found a loophole in the 14th Amendment where it says a state may not abridge the rights and privileges and immunities, but it said nothing about a privately owned business. So in essence, people are not going to a state-owned cafeteria. They're not going to a state-owned hotel. So in essence, this decision by the U.S. Supreme Court continued the discrimination of Black folks with regard to public accommodation. Justice Harlan, who at one time was actually a slave owner in Kentucky, wrote the lone dissenting opinion. And in his dissent, he argued that segregation in public accommodations was a badge of slavery for the recently freed African Americans, and that the act could be constitutionally justified by looking to the 13th Amendment. The amendment gave Congress the authority to outlaw all badges and incidents of slavery. Harlan pointed out that before the Civil War, the Supreme Court protected the rights of slaveholders. In less than 20 years after the end of slavery, the court, here in 1883, refused to extend its power and authority to protect the former slaves. And actually, in that session of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883, not only did they nullify aspects of the 14th Amendment, they also ruled essentially that the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 was actually unconstitutional because Congress did not have purview, didn't have a right to pass that kind of legislation. The other thing they absolutely overturned was the 15th Amendment. It was a part of that package that went before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1883. And the court said in essence that the 15th Amendment did give the former slaves the right to vote, but it did not give them the right not to be discriminated against when they went to the polls to vote. In other words, if there's some legislation passed by a state that says this person cannot vote, you still have the right to vote. The state just put an impediment in front of you. So the court absolutely, was playing around with the 14th and 15th Amendments, using little words to disallow Black folk access to public accommodations and access to hope. So by 1883, the 15th Amendment had been nullified by the U.S. Supreme Court. Within a few years, as a result of those 1883 decisions, disfranchisement legislation was passed by the states. Grandfather clause was passed first by Mississippi in 1890 and then by other states. North Carolina passed a grandfather clause in 1897. All of you know and have heard about literacy tests. Poll taxes were passed. Good moral character references were passed. Segregated education, Jim Crow legislation in every phase of life between Blacks and whites. By 1905, more than 3,300 people had been lynched in the United States. And between 1882 and 1968, almost 5,000 Black folks were lynched. 115 of them were female, Black and white. And so when you look at the lynch victims between 1882 and about 1968, 73% of them were Black. You got to know that folks were not just sitting around doing nothing. Organizations sprang up. The church was actively involved. Institutions, organizations to fight on many different levels, whether it was economic, political, or social. These organizations emerged primarily in the 1880s. And one such organization which was actually a forerunner to all of the big five organizations that we look at today in terms of NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, all those organizations owe their existence to some extent to the Afro-American League that was founded by T. Thomas Fortune back in 1890. And later the Afro-American League and the Niagara Movement in 1905 and 1909, the NAACP. But when you look at all of these organizations, even the ones that were fighting in the 1960s, look at the basic objectives. Equal opportunities in voting. They started that in the 1880s and continue right to the present time. Civil rights in general, still fighting. Educational opportunities, oh my God, how we fight. Public accommodations, seeking an end to Jim Crow laws through legislation. They started that in the 1890s. And seeking an end to lynchings in the South. Those organizations sprang up. We're talking about efforts by people down at Tuskegee Institute to bring attention to lynchings. The NAACP bringing attention to lynchings. George H. White trying to bring attention to lynchings. He talked about it, when he was a congressman, the only congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, fighting against lynching, actually introduced legislation placing lynching bees, lynching mob activity. He wanted to make it a capital offense. Of course, the bill, folks have said, sweetly died in committee. But these organizations very early were fighting to do the same thing the folks are doing 120 years later. So institutional formation, organizational formation began early by Black folks in the 1880s and 1890s. I'll stop here and we don't have very much time, so I guess I better go ahead. I felt tonight. The Native American question, the establishment of reservations, a plan of genocide, Native American legislation, and Western redemption. How do we redeem ourselves against these folks who were here when we got here in 1492, 1607 in the case of colonial America? As early as 1851, the United States government established concentrations. We hear about the reservations that were established in 1867, but as early as 1851, because of that westward movement by whites to Colorado and to California, the US came up with this idea that we will place Native Americans on reservations that they essentially called concentrations. We'll concentrate them in this area and in areas that were least favorable for cultivation of land, little access to waterways and so forth, to allow whites to make it to those areas in the Midwest and in the West. Access to Western lands. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act that many of us knew about that gave millions of acres of land to white settlers moving to the West. But in the process of giving that land to them, and we won't even talk about the fact that if they ain't affirmative action never existed. We're talking about millions and millions of acres of land. This obviously displaced Native American populations that have been pushed out there as a result of the act that was passed in 1830 to displace the Native American population. That all of us know about the march in the 1830s to the western part, the Trail of Tears. And then it was in 1867 that Congress established the reservation system that forced hundreds of thousands of indigenous people into restricted areas in the West. And just as a note here, in 1865, there were approximately 400,000 indigenous people in the United States. 35 years later, that population had dwindled to 290,000. The Buffalo population in 1865 was approximately 12 million. That population dwindled significantly. Significantly is probably not the best word after 1865. Hundreds of thousands of buffalo were killed annually as a sport. We're talking about the Transcontinental Railroad. People are on those trains just shooting buffalo. When Native Americans killed buffalo at specific times, because the buffalo was everything to Native Americans. In 1900, there were about 300 buffalo in the United States. So went the buffalo, so went the Native American population. Population of a buffalo today is about 500,000. In terms of legislation passed by Congress with regard to the indigenous population, I think most of you probably have heard of the Dawes Act. It was passed by Congress in 1887, an act to provide for the allotment of lands in severalty to Indians on the various reservations. Treatment of Native Americans as individuals rather than as members of tribes. Essentially, it was an attempt to make the Native American population, to make them agriculturalists. Lands were allotted to families to cultivate and to grow crops. It was a path to citizenship. It was an attempt to, quote, civilize these uncivilized savages. Finishing as well as boarding schools were established to assimilate Native American children, probably in the neighborhood of 75,000 children eventually went to these boarding and finishing schools. I think some of us have heard about the massacres that took place as early as as early as whites came into the Americas. Of course, the slaughter actually began. No one can say for certain how many indigenous people there were in what we now call the United States, that is the 48 contiguous states, but I've seen estimates as high as 3.5 million. And by 1865, that number was 400,000. And the Chivington massacre, example of the killing of just scores and scores of people that occurred in southeastern Colorado. You've heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Well, this actually was a battle in which the Native Americans were successful. And all of us have heard of a Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Approximately 300 Lakota Indians were slaughtered by the United States Army. This is actually referred to as the Native Americans' last stand. The war since 1865 seemingly were about breaking the will of the indigenous people and forcing them to accept the white man's way of life. And it was not until June 2nd, 1924, that all Native Americans were made citizens of the United States if they were born, of course, in the United States. Under the Indian Citizenship Act. And one of the reasons why there was the big push to get this done was because, according to Calvin Coolidge, Native Americans had played such an instrumental role in fighting for America's independence, so to speak, in World War I. The growth of industrialism after 1865. American industrialism exploded after 1865. Much can be attributed to a vast amount of raw and natural resources like copper and coal and iron and timber and the many, many crops that were grown throughout the South. The railroad industry grew overnight. The transcontinental railroad was completed by 1879. All of us know about the huge number of inventions, including the electric light that lit up the cities. So it gave rise to the growth of cities. Telephone was invented, the air brake system for trains, refrigeration, the growth of textile mills in the South added to this industrial growth. And this one quote here, I think, really sums up the impact that technology and industrialism had, between 1860 and about 1900. Quote, Americans who were born in the 1840s and 1850s would experience enormous changes in their lifetimes. Some of these changes resulted from a sweeping technological revolution. Their major source of light, for example, would change from candles to kerosene lamps and then to electric light bulbs. They would see their transportation evolve from walking and horsepower to steam-powered locomotives to electric trolley cars to gasoline-powered automobiles. Born into a society in which the vast majority of people were involved in agriculture, they experienced an industrial revolution that radically changed the way millions of people worked and where they lived. They would experience the migration of millions of people from rural America to the nation's rapidly growing cities. I think it sums up to a great extent, the period between 1860 and 1900, and we could also, extrapolate that same idea and talk about where we are today. Here we are on Zoom, looking at each other, talking to each other. The revolution that has just taken place in this country in the last 20 years with regard to computer technology, is a continuation of this technology and industrial order that began after 1865. The industrial period obviously gave rise to the growth of what Matthew Josephson called the robber barons, people like John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Jay Gould, the Dukes of Durham. Matthew Josephson published a book entitled The Robber Barons in 1937. Monopolies and the trusts, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, the tobacco industry. If you lived in China, if you lived in Europe, wherever you lived around the world in 1900, if you smoked a cigarette, more than likely it was made in Durham, North Carolina. If you used a match to light that cigarette, more than likely it was made by the American Match Company. If you had steel in your house, in your building, it was made by US Steel. If you went to a supermarket in 1920, more than likely it was A&P. Some of y'all probably never even heard of A&P. Maybe a little bit too young for that, but A&P, like Kroger, dominated the scene in the 1920s until, trust busting and this effort to break down the monopolies. If you ate sugar in the 1890s and thereafter, it was probably manufactured by E.C. Knight Company. They manufactured 95% of the sugar that was manufactured in this country. And of course, by the early 1880s and 1890s, those monopolies, those trusts had grown to the extent that Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Legislation to curb the activities of the trusts. But for the most part, very much unsuccessful. We know where we are today in terms of who owns America. You turned your computer on this morning, more than likely it's Microsoft. More than likely. They have a monopoly. If you turn it on in China, if you turn it on in Japan, more than likely it was Microsoft. If you talked on the telephone 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was AT&T. The railroad industry had grown to the extent that it needed to be checked. So Congress passed in 1887 the Interstate Commerce Act that created the Interstate Commerce Commission to check the railroad industry, because railroad could do whatever they wanted to do. And even with the Interstate Commerce Commission, I know at one time between about 1890 and 1905, 16 cases went before the ICC, and industry won 15 of the 16 cases. So, big business, industry, like it does today, it rules out. It continues to win, without a doubt. When President Roosevelt, of course, became president, he was known as the trust buster. He believed that in essence, people should have access, that there should be a level playing field, that more than one company should manufacture cigarettes. More than 5 companies should be responsible for the steel that is used in businesses, buildings, and across the United States. And of course, there were efforts by the labor unions to check the growing industrial order. And the first of these was founded in 1866. The National Labor Union was founded. Many of you probably are familiar with the Knights of Labor that was founded in 1869. It was one of those organizations that believed in using the strike as a way to get management to the table to deal with the problems that workers faced on a daily basis. It was nothing for a 14-year-old child to be eaten up by machines. It was nothing for rats and dogs and cats and whatever else to be ground up into meat. And that brings us to the establishment of FDA in 1906. And so there were a number of organizations that were established to check the rising industrial order. The American Federation of Labor, which is still in existence today, became one of those organizations that definitely took big business and industry to task. Around 1935, CIO, the Congress of International Organization, what CIO stands for, CIO, it brought that together around 1935. So now it's AFL-CIO. And those organizations that organization is still in existence today, along with a few others. And probably in the last few months, we may have seen the re-emergence of unions and their potential power, because Ronald Reagan, for the most part, killed the union movement back in the 1880s when he allowed essentially organizations, business, industry to leave the United States with those huge tax breaks that he gave them. And rather than a union, rather than business bowing to a union, it would just simply close its doors. And it meant that folks didn't have a job. So the power of the unions is really good to see them kind of reemerge. You even saw your President Biden out there on the union picket line just a few months ago. Immigration to the United States. Of course, all this stuff is so inextricably tied together. I'll go through it real fast. The new industrial order was fueled, migration was actually fueled by the growing industrial order. Folks were coming from Northern Europe, Southeastern Europe, between 1880 and 1930, well over about 24 million people came to the United States from primarily Europe. And over the centuries, one group has tried to exclude or restrict another group from coming to the US based on religion, geography, ethnicity, race, or whatever. What we see today in efforts to restrict folks from Haiti or from the Caribbean or folks from Africa or folks from Latin American countries, that's not new. It's always been the case. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, which actually excluded Asians. In 1882, you probably have heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act. The quest to acquire lands beyond US boundaries and the rise of US imperialism. We can look straight to Hawaii. There were people in 1865 who believed that America should do what France and Spain and England had been doing for hundreds of years, and that was to acquire lands outside of their continental bounds. And the United States was successful in acquiring Alaska in 1867 from the Russians for $7.2 million. That was really William H. Seward's baby. He believed that America should expand. The fight for Hawaii, my God, when you look at Hawaii and where it's located, it was believed that the European powers, that they were going to be fighting for Hawaii. And as early as 1820, America began sending missionaries out there. In 1859, by 1860, surely churches were constructed. 1876, this reciprocity treaty was signed between the US and Hawaii. And what it said was that Hawaii could send their sugar and their pineapple and other goods to the US free of duty. And in exchange for that, the United States asked or pretty much demanded Hawaii not to have relations with other European powers. In other words, don't make treaties with them. And by 1887, although the construction of Pearl Harbor did not begin in 1887, the United States got access or received access to that area that became, a military fort out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Very early, there began a movement called Hawaii for Hawaiians. In other words, the rest of y'all get the hell out. It was a movement that opposed Hawaiian annexation by the United States. We want to be left alone. Queen Colonies was overthrown in 1893 by about 50 Marines from the United States. And 1898, Hawaii was annexed. And 1959, it became a state, became the 50th state. The Spanish-American War and the US ascendancy to world power. Now, up until about 1898, the only lands that the US had outside of her boundaries was Alaska. In 1898, now you have annexed Hawaii. But the fact that they went to war with Spain in 1898 and beat Spain in about 3 months, began her ascendancy to becoming the world power that she is today. Remember the Maine that was blown up in 1898, probably not blown up by the Spaniards. It was an accident, but it became a rallying cry. And then we know about yellow journalism. We know about the fact that newspaper reports say that the Spaniards blew it up. And here we are 2 months later, declaring war on Spain. The U.S. defeated Spain, and under the Treaty of Paris that was signed on December 10th, 1898, the United States received Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And that began her quest. And with the acquisition of all of these territories, that's when America was on its way to becoming this world power. And we know what they did in Cuba. We know what they did in the Philippines. We know what they did in Guam and in Puerto Rico. Why do the Cubans hate us today? Why do the Filipino people hate us today? It has a lot to do with what America has done. And if you want to really understand US imperialism, you want to understand this period between 1860 and 2006, take a look at Stephen Kinzer's book, Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could give you a standing ovation, I would. That's a wonderful place to end. I hope you guys are able to take that note. If you need me to put a link in the chat, say so. We only have a few minutes left, so if there are any pertinent must-ask questions, please ask away. Or I am planning to, and I would hope that you guys could join in the near future. I have one more presentation I want to get done somewhere in the summer. And then I, of course, as we've done in previous years with RELC, would love to have a recap where I send out everything and we have a ability to kind of follow up in a different type way, especially for you guys who show up for these lunchtime chats in real time, give a chance to refresh, have thoughts and ideas that you want to put on the table. So that's on the horizon, in case we have things that we want to, unpack that we didn't get the chance to in real time. So anybody have anything they want to throw out there that's quick and fast that we can unpack, or we can sit on it and follow up another time? And I'm hopeful that Dr. Parker will be able to join, that Andrew Turner would be able to join, and we can just have some conversations based on what's been presented thus far. And again, I have one other presentation that I'd like to get done before then. Just a wonderful lady who does some genealogy work. She's the wife of one of my colleagues. Her name is Karen Skelton. We're going to have a discussion, if everything aligns, that is going to give you guys an understanding of interracial relationships that took place, that have a lot of nuance and things that are worth unpacking as well. We don't get to the collectivity of how we become Americans in appearance without some intermixing that was not always frowned upon, so to speak. So there's a lineage attached to that we can unpack, and I'm looking forward to doing that one in the not too distant future. But Dr. Parker, I'm grateful as always, and again, perfect ending, because something that you brought to my attention many years ago was, what did we lose in this process, and what opportunities did we miss? And I think the Reconstruction era sheds a bright light on all of the potential and possibility that was disrupted, and it's cost us something. And we're great in our minds in America, but we could be so much better in actual things that we do, and opportunities that we could take advantage of for the betterment of us all. So hopefully that's right around the corner. Hope. All hearts and minds are content, as the church would say. Again, thank you, Dr. Parker. Thank you all for for making time for another lunchtime chat. I look forward to catching up with some of you on a more personal basis because there's always something else to talk about. But I appreciate you all showing up and showing out, and I'll get this one captured and put together and sent out to the group. And there are a couple of things in the chat. I think Ajane just put something else up there. Yeah, Hunter had a comment about
Right, those green stamps.
Yeah, Hunter's from one of those areas that still I think has some A&P legacy. Many states in the South and Midwest have just repealed a large portion of child labor protections as of this year. Yeah, there was people actually had kids working in some plants and things. Of course, Ajane, thanks you for a wonderful presentation. I'll say really quickly, this stuff is not fixed. That's the whole. We could crystallize some things that just make sense for a healthy society, yet there's somebody somewhere chipping away and figuring out how to fracture and cause fissures in things that just make sense for us to adhere to perpetually. Thank you so much again, Dr. Parker. Thank you all. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care.
Get outside if you can. Take care. Be good.
Bye.